Good evening. Welcome to UT Brainstorms. I'm Mike Mock, a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at UT Austin. We sponsor Brainstorms to share our expertise and passion about neuroscience with you and to learn from your questions and concerns. We very much hope, as always, that this is a conversation and it will be a two-way street. As always, thanks to Laura and Ian and Elena Silva, who manage everything. We couldn't do it without them, so thank you, Laura and Elena. So this is Brainstorms number 35, and we just want to say, as usual, thank you so much for your support. We'll keep doing these as long as people find them interesting. So thank you for continuing to attend and to support us. Thanks also to those of you who have supported us financially through Hornraiser and the 40 for 40 campaign. Thank you so much. The format is simple. Our speaker will give about a 45-minute talk, and then he'll introduce his panel of 2 UT faculty members, and they will answer your questions. You type in your questions into the YouTube chat, and it's okay to start typing in those questions even during the talk. That gets our panelists ready in thinking about them to answer them. So what a great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Bill Schwartz from the UT Dell Medical School. In addition to being a great guy, Bill is a very important part of the UT neuroscience community. He's currently Assistant Dean for Faculty Affairs and Professor and Associate Chair for Research and Education in Neurology at Dell Medical School. He's also a courtesy professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at UT. For over 4 decades, he has conducted research on the mechanisms, locations, and functions of our biological clocks. Bill completed his MD degree in neurology and residency at the University of California, San Francisco, did a research fellowship at the National Institute of Mental Health, and was on the faculties at Harvard Med School, Mass General Hospital, and the University of Massachusetts before coming here to UT Austin. So it's always the worst part of this Zoom format, but let's find a way to send Bill our warm greetings and welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Bill Schwartz.
Thanks very much, Mike, for that introduction, and I am feeling the warm reception. It's great to be the 35th speaker of this series. So tonight, our conversation is on the rhythmic brain, conversation about all of our biological clocks. And I'd like to present a case which we'll solve by the end of the talk. It's Mr. AP. He's 74. He was self-referred to my clinic. I saw him in clinic some years ago. His complaint was to get help in resetting my upside down circadian clock. So I guess we're imagining it looks something like this. So what's the story here? Well, he described it about 2 years ago. He developed a fear of going to sleep, and he started to delay his sleep later each night. Then he began to experience difficulty initiating sleep, and when I saw him, he was unable to sleep in bed and instead was using an easy chair. He said that he thought, in addition to his insomnia, he had an upside down circadian clock, as he often found himself awake all night, would often fall asleep exhausted the next day, sometime between 9 in the morning and say 2 in the afternoon. Sleep hours were irregular. He said he might be awake for 40 hours at a time. He had been taking an antidepressant to help him get to sleep, trazodone, and lorazepam, 1 milligram 5 times a day, a benzodiazepine, which is a lot. Past history, well, he avoided 8 a.m. classes in college, but doesn't recall any difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep then. Graduated in 1955, degree in philosophy, decided that he didn't want the same job, no matter what, for the rest of my life. So he had worked as a jazz musician, a school teacher, political campaign worker, during which time he developed very irregular sleep schedules. He told me he had a 10-day campaign stretch during which he went to bed 3 times. So 2 years ago, when he dates the onset of this problem, he had no job. He was caring for his mother when she passed away. He discovered afterwards that she owed $40,000 in real estate back taxes, and believes that his increased anxiety and depression over this may have contributed to a sleep disorder. And he had a decades-long history of seeing psychiatrists. So if we're going to solve this one, I guess we need to know something about this circadian clock. So let me get us up to speed on that and start with the challenge. So the challenge for all of us is to adapt to life on this rotating world, where half of us are in sunlight and half of us are in dark. And so this adaptation of day and night affects all living things, right? Plants that require light for photosynthesis during the day, many of them close their leaves up at night. For animals that are alternating being awake and asleep, their sleep is timed to, in the case of this hamster, to the most economical and safe time to be sleeping, which would be for the day, and they're up at night. And we can all think of ourselves, of these daily rhythms. But the amazing and fascinating thing is that many of these rhythms, these daily rhythms, are actually the reflection of an internal, an endogenous, an innate timekeeping mechanism, a clock, if you will, which we call the circadian clock. And the features of this physiology are very important and being appreciated now, as I'm sure all of you know. The properties of this clock allow organisms to recognize local time, so that's like a sundial, and also to measure the lapse of time, like an hourglass. And it's used or adapted or purposed so that organisms can maintain an internal temporal order, so that, you know, hormone 1 is secreted before hormone 2, before behavior Y is required. Because of the nature of the mechanisms of this clock, it allows organisms to actually anticipate environmental change, anticipate the dawn or the dusk before it occurs, and also is used as kind of a marker, or can mark opportune points of time, the most economical or best time to be doing certain functions. And then finally, it's at the base of other applications, adaptations to seasonal changes, and also in birds and butterflies that migrate during the seasons. For those animals that use the sun to tell them which direction they're going, they obviously need to know what time it is to know whether the sun is actually rising or setting. So all of these are features of this internal mechanism. Here's a little cartoon which graphs this. So if we graph days going down like so, and we imagine photosynthesis or sleep and wake, you know, it's rhythmic, in this case, high during the day, the light period of the 24 hours. What was uncovered almost 300 years ago, first in plants, was that if you actually look at organisms in constant environmental conditions, for example, constant darkness, many of these rhythms will persist, as this one is here, you see, and precisely as well. You can see I draw a line through it, but the timing is not exactly 24 hours. In this case, the rhythm occurs a little later each day, a little later each day. It's about a day rhythm, that is circadian. So circadian comes from the fact that these endogenously generated rhythms, when we look at them without any external cues, are about a day. Here's an actual recording of the same type. It's a mouse. In a laboratory, the lights are on here, the lights are off. As you know, the mouse is active during the dark period. And then if we put the animal in constant darkness, with all other environmental cues constant, you can see that this rhythm of locomotor activity, running in a wheel, persists. In this case, it's happening a little quicker or a little faster than 24 hours. Sometimes we graph these double plotted, so-called double plotted. It's still the same animal. We just have, instead of 24 hours, this way, we have 48 hours. So we can see this rhythm progressing over the course of time. So hundreds of years have passed with many scientists, and many experiments have led to the conception that this rhythm is the external manifestation of this internal clock with a period, that is an oscillation, that's about 24 hours, and that under normal circumstances, during day and night or light and dark, that oscillation is rigidly synchronized to 24 hours. It's entrained by the outside light-dark cycle. And it's not only mice, it's humans too. So humans placed in caves or special laboratories, again, in isolation without any environmental cues, will also show these circadian rhythms. In this case, this is sleep, the long bar, and temperature minimum and temperature maximum. This circadian rhythm in constant conditions is sometimes referred to as free running. And its period, that is how quickly it completes one cycle, is often denoted by the Greek letter tau. So this mouse period would be less than 24 hours, 23 point something hours. And for humans, it's slightly more than 24 hours. So these clocks are universal, found throughout nature, in bacteria, unicellulars, fungus, plants, snails, moths, cockroaches, fruit flies, sparrows, hamsters, mice, and even in the late Sean Connery, us. And the basic sort of diagram, the block diagram of the way this has been conceptualized is that here is this internal clock or oscillator or pacemaker shown here, and it is synchronized by external cues. That is, it's entrained to run at exactly 24 hours. The most powerful one of these is light. And then it somehow translates this timing to a signal through pathways to rhythms which we can measure. And in the last 50 years, that is in many of our lifetimes, new physiological systems have been discovered that correspond to these little cartoons, really quite extraordinary. So the entrainment pathway, the pathway by which light synchronizes the clock, actually depends to a large extent on a system in the retina that hadn't been discovered before. So here's a little cartoon of our retina. Light would come in from the bottom, the way this is drawn, like so, up this way, passes through all the layers of the retina to the rods and cones, which have opsons that are sensitive to light or sense color. And then through a maze of cellular interactions, the signal is conveyed to ganglion cells, which then send their axons to the brain. And relatively recently in the history of the retina was the discovery that some of these ganglion cells can sense light themselves, actually, and depend on an opsin that's primitive called melanopsin. This was not known before. these cells actually look somewhat different than the other sort of orthodox ganglion cells, if you will. And they appear to play a major role in entraining this circadian system. Interestingly, the sensitivity of this opsin, that is the wavelength of light that it's most sensitive to, is in the blue range. And so this may already sort of remind you of things that you've been reading about the trouble with blue light from computers or phones at night disturbing our sleep. Well, this now starts to begin to explain that. So a whole new photoreceptive system for entraining the clock. The clock itself, the premier clock, is in the brain, and this is a section of rat brain cut, as neuroanatomists would show. And what's shown here is a stain that shows where the neurons are, and the arrow shows the location of an area of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the location of the brain's master clock, if you will. It's about 1 millimeter long and about that long in us as well. It's in humans in about the same place, deep in the brain, shown here. Here's the cut section. It's in the area of the brain called the hypothalamus, deep here in the brain above the pituitary. The data, the experiments that make the case for this being the master clock are really incredible, an incredible set of experiments in neuroscience. It is the site of this pacemaker. Experiments have shown, which I won't go into, that it's both necessary and sufficient for the expression of behavioral rhythmicity based on lesions and transplants of the structure. Intrinsic properties have been measured, including its energy metabolism, gene expression, neurophysiological activity, and those exhibit circadian rhythmicity in the brain. And if you take the nuclei out as a slice, on the dish, it continues to run with a circadian rhythm about a day. Other experiments shown that this pacemaker in the SCN is composed actually of multiple single cell oscillators, so that the basic oscillatory mechanism actually resides within the cell. And this, as you might imagine, led to, over a couple of decades, the elucidation of what this basic oscillatory mechanism was. And this is a very simplified diagram, but gives you the idea that there's a set of genes that oscillate, and the whole system oscillates with a 24-hour period. So there are genes called clock genes. Here we have genes period 1, 2, and 3, or cryptochrome 1 and 2, and they are regulated. Their expression is regulated by transcription factors. The messenger RNA is transcribed, a protein corresponding to them is translated, and a number of events happen out here in the cytoplasm. They bind to each other, they're phosphorylated, and eventually they re-enter the nucleus and inhibit their own transcription. There's a delay out here in the cytoplasm and elsewhere that this whole rhythm takes about 24 hours. So that's the basic oscillatory mechanism, and it's not only important for sort of understanding basic science, but it's led to two other things which have been important. Number one is molecular biologists can fiddle with this and make artificial genes where they take the promoters of these clock genes and have those promoters direct other genes that we can actually see. And now I have to switch to this, I discovered. So here's one of these artificial constructs where the promoter for the period gene is now driving a gene which will produce a protein which under right conditions will glow. And so here are isolated SCN cells, And I'll play this movie, and you'll see all these cells which are isolated from each other flashing. They're all oscillating with a 24-hour period. The one with the yellow arrow is the one graphed underneath. Now you can see while you were looking at that, that's not going to be a very useful clock. They all seem to be running independently of each other. But if we take now the whole nucleus and put it in a dish, the cells interact with each other and we get a rhythm like this. And a current area of intense interest is how do these isolated cells interact and talk to each other to give that integrated 24-hour rhythm from the nucleus. So that's been really a remarkable advance that's been made by knowing the identity of genes. The other big advance is it was discovered that these oscillations are occurring not only in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but essentially all over the body. And here shown, if you'll forgive me, I'll go back to my laser pointer. Here shown in cartoon that there's a circadian clock in the liver, in the heart, in the adrenal, in the kidney, in muscle, in skin, wherever you look. And so the picture from that simple diagram I gave you actually has turned out to be much more complicated. So yes, there's an external cue, primarily light and dark, but as you'll see, other cues. Light and dark, which sets the speed, entrains, synchronizes the period and the timing of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And by a variety of output mechanisms, some of them are behavioral, body temperature rhythm, hormones, of course, autonomic nervous system, conveys its timing signal, its view of the outside world to all of these organs. And of course, it's complex because each of these organs receives a different suite of strengths and different types of inputs. But those clocks then direct a number of the metabolic or physiological outputs of these organs. Here are some of these arrows. You see the complexities that a rhythm of blood glucose itself actually starts to act on behavior in a negative way. Glucocorticoids secreted by the adrenal are hormones themselves, and so on. A further complication is that a number of rhythmic behaviors, like when we eat or don't eat, a behavior can influence the system here, downstream of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and influence the timing of one or more of these different organs. And so you can see the complexity and actually the beauty of being able to alter your network for internal time, but also how it might lead to trouble in pathology. And we'll be able to talk about that during the discussion, I'm sure. So the end result of all of this is human daily rhythmicity with almost anything that you measure: body temperature, melatonin, bowel movements here on this, alertness, reaction time. It varies over the course of the day. Here are just a couple. Here's the rhythm of tissue type plasminogen activity. This is endogenous clotting activity, anti-clotting activity, and it's lowest in the morning when in fact strokes and heart attacks are more likely to occur. Here's the hour of birth for humans, which really does occur during the night, during the rest phase, which makes sense because in nature, you wouldn't want to be dropping your kids while you're out and about foraging. Here is a useful one, tooth pain threshold, which is actually highest in the afternoon after lunch. So the time to go to the dentist is not in the morning when you might think so, but actually after lunch. I've got there are an endless number of these. All right. Well, what about Mr. AP? Well, in the office, a diagnostic procedure was performed. And when I give this, I've given this case to various medical groups and ask them for their opinions. And usually they're asking for polysomnograms or MRIs or other kinds of things. And I won't ask this group here, but actually what I did ask was, geez, that sounds crazy. Have you kept a record of this? And he said, actually, he had been keeping a sleep log, although it was on multiple 3x5 cards and not in any usable form. I don't know the age distribution of the audience, so I don't want to insult anybody, but I do want to show this is a 3x5 card, a very handy instrument where you could write notes and file them in a box or your pocket. And they belong to other lost arts that make me sigh: liquid paper, rub on letters, a slide rule, slides, oh well. So he went home, and months later, I got something in the mail, which was this. Because I told him, as I've shown you, how to take those 3x5 cards, good luck, and make an actogram out of it. And so he went home and he did it. So months later, he sent me 7 pages that looked like this. And here's days going from the top to the bottom. And here you see he's graphed when he went to sleep and when he woke up. And you can see he's done this. He did a bunch of calculations over here, which are hard to see. But one of them was, consecutive hours awake. And it varies from 38 hours to 4 hours, really wild looking. So there's 7 pages of this, and you'll guess what I did with this. I put them in the Xerox machine and made them small. Then I double plotted them and pasted them together with sticky tape to make a double plotted actogram like I showed you in the previous slide. And when I did that, I saw this. So he's free running. This is a free running rhythm. It has some interesting features, which we won't debate, where it seems like he gets to a certain time and then there's a jump and then it continues, jump. There are these jumps, but he's free running with a period that's greater than 24 hours. It's as though he's in complete isolation in a cave and is not perceiving the light for the purposes of his circadian system, although he's not blind. Here at this point, something happened that he synchronized, he entrained. And when I saw him later in clinic and showed him this and asked him about it, we couldn't figure out what that was. It was a short period and then off he went. And so, we were seeing something that looked something like this. And this is called, nowadays, the non-24-hour sleep-wake syndrome. It's, as we say, a failure of entrainment of the clock and the clock system to the 24-hour day-night. As you'd guess, the most obvious causes for this would be temporal isolation, like we said, or blindness, but only a certain kind of blindness that would involve those melanopsin ganglion cells. Now we're realizing that less commonly this is occurring in sighted individuals. And of course, they're not going to see the ophthalmologist because instead, what they're describing often is a sleep disorder. So here's an interesting study. I'll just show this one study from Japan, 57 of these cases of this syndrome in people who are not blind. At this hospital, it was 15% of all circadian sleep disorders. Age of onset, about 20. Most were male, overwhelmingly unmarried, all with a history of severely disrupted social function and psychiatric problems. And whether this disrupted clock is the cause of various psychiatric problems, or whether a psychiatric trait also affects the clock, or what the relation between these two, of course, is fascinating and not known yet. Here's just one other example. 4 years. Here's a sleep log of 4 years. It was published of a psychology student at Oxford who, as you can see, through all 4 years of college, had various variable sleep, but at times was free running as well. And just before we finish with what I said to Mr. AP, I want to mention another circadian sleep syndrome, if you will. And this one is not, it's also a problem with entrainment, if you will, but not a lack of entrainment. It's that the entrainment or the timing is at sort of perhaps an odd time of day. And so this gets to people who you know, early birds and night owls. So some people are genetically early. So for example, and we would call that in circadian language, the phase of entrainment is early or advanced. Here's a cartoon of an actogram where we have 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., say at night, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. during the day. And here's the sleep. And you can see that this person is going to bed around 8 p.m. and getting up maybe at 4 or 5 in the morning. You can make out that the green must be the weekends, 5 days, 2 days, 5 days, 2 days. Generally, these people, these early birds, don't complain about their sleep because actually they like it. It's quiet in the morning, they can get a lot of work done. It's usually the partner who brings them into the clinic with the complaint. Now, the opposite, if you will, of this would be delayed. A delayed phase of entrainment, a night owl or a late type. This person is going to bed at 5 in the morning here and waking up at about 11 in the afternoon. And you can see in this kind of situation, they are actually living on a completely delayed schedule from many of the rest of us. And you'll see that neither this nor that are diseases. I mean, entrainment is pretty good. They're running with a 24-hour period. They're not having any difficulties. The difficulty comes in normal society because then this delayed person, their sleep looks more like this. And you may know someone like this, right? So now they're forced to try to go to sleep earlier. They can't get to sleep that early. It's still 1 in the morning. They're awakened by the alarm clock abruptly here at 7 in the morning. And then over the weekend, they try to catch up on this sleep. They go to bed later in general and wake up late. The problem here is twofold. One is during the week, they're sleep deprived because they're actually getting less duration of sleep than they really need. And the other is that on the weekends, they're actually undergoing a kind of jet lag, right? So on Friday night, their sleep is delayed. From here, it's like they might be flying to Hawaii. And then on Sunday night, they fly back from Honolulu to Austin. And this occurs every week. Till Ronenberg in Munich has coined this problem a social jet lag, because it really is due only to our society and the way our society is constructed. The problem is that people rely on stimulants. The late types rely on stimulants to keep them awake during the day. So here is on the y-axis, this vertical axis is the percent of the people. And on the x-axis is a measure of social jet lag. How much of this yanking sleep around between weekday and weekend is going on. So the further to the right, the more the late type who has to make more of an adjustment. And you see that there's a association between increased smoking, increased alcohol, increased caffeine. as you might expect, this might affect schoolwork as well. Here's a scary study from a Dutch high school looking at almost 5,000 grades of the students. And the students filled out the questionnaire so they could be classified as either early types, which are labeled chronotype, or late chronotype, so early or late types. And here were the grades on tests that are taken either in the morning, early morning, late morning, or early afternoon. And you can see that when the tests are given first thing in the morning, the early chronotypes are doing much better than the late ones. I guess that seems intuitive. The late ones, for the late ones, it's still night, or should be still night. And then by the afternoon, we've lost that advantage. Now, importantly, there is no difference in IQ between early and late chronotypes. It's really the timing, and the timing in relation to our society. So, in a sense, early school start times are a form of discrimination against late chronotypes. And, having going to medical school at a time when in college one had to take an 8-hour organic chemistry lab and then an 8-hour physical chemistry lab that began at 8 a.m., I can tell you that medical school admissions were a form of discrimination against late chronotypes. All right, well, so what's Mr. AP's problem? Well, we don't know. It could be a number of problems along this pathway from the eye to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So, for example, maybe he's living an isolated lifestyle and the light intensity is inadequate to stimulate his melanopsin system. Maybe his circadian visual system, the melanopsin system, maybe it has a mutation or mutations and is subsensitive. Maybe the SCN itself is not seeing the signal. Or there are theoretical reasons that from oscillator theory that if your clock is wants to run slow, really slow, it may be beyond the possibility of entrainment. Anyway, I initiated a therapeutic trial, and this was based on circadian principles, and which we haven't gone over here, but let me show you. So look, I said, I showed him his actogram, just like I showed you. I gave him more or less this talk, drew it out on a piece of paper. And then I said, look, let's see if we can capture your clock as it's running around 24 hours. So to attempt entrainment, and I said, what time? He said, well, if I go to bed at 2 in the morning, so 2 to 10. So his sleep onset approaches at 2, melatonin, a small dose at 9 p.m. This is hours before his anticipated sleep time. And at a time when melatonin may have an effect on moving the clock, advancing the clock to an earlier time. Keep the lights dim, don't stimulate the clock with that blue light in the evening, which would tend to delay it. Advance the clock in the morning with bright light, remain in light during the day, don't take a nap, don't take the trazodone. And I gave him a follow-up appointment, which was a couple of months away. A couple of months passed, and he didn't show, which is not always unusual. Sometimes patients forget or they don't show. So I told the admin, could they call him and set up a new appointment, which they did, which was a couple of months later. And he missed that one as well. And so I called him. I would have made a house call, but he lived further away. So I called him and I said, hello, this is Dr. Schwartz from the neurology clinic. He said, yes. I said, do you remember me? He said, I do. I saw you about your sleep. Yes, yes, yes. We talked about something you could do to see if you could set your sleep to be more systematic. Yes, yes, I remember that. Did you try it? Nope. Did you try it? No, no, I didn't do it. Well, why? And he said, well, after you showed me that actogram, as you called it, and after I saw what was happening, I realized I'm not crazy after all. It's just a free running clock. And it's kind of fun because then I could predict when I might be most alert, when I would be not alert, when I could go to dinner, when I could not go to dinner. And it was fun to predict my time and to have control over my life. So the lesson, the clinical lesson to finish here is a one that was described by a famous Boston physician, Francis Weld Peabody. The treatment of a disease must be completely impersonal, but the treatment of a patient must be completely personal. And what he really wanted to know was what was happening to him, so that the secret of the care of the patient is actually in caring for the patient. And so we were able, standing on the shoulders of giants over hundreds of years, and especially in the last 50 years, to have enough basic science from fruit flies and fungus and mice applied to humans to be able to help Mr. AP understand what was happening to him. And I would like to introduce my panel. But they have to show themselves. There they are. So I have the privilege and the fun and the honor of having a world famous panel. So at least, I guess it's for you two on my left is Dr. Laura Funkin, who's an assistant professor of pharmacology and toxicology. She's famous for work before she came to UT, really looking at the effects of light given at the wrong time, which everybody will now appreciate may lead to all sorts of troubles. Here at UT, she's actually working on the mechanisms by which the clock is modulating or regulating our neuroimmune function in all sorts of neuroimmunological diseases. And next to her is Molly Bray. Molly is professor in the Susan T. Jastrow Endowed Chair in the Department of Nutritional Sciences. She is at least equally, if not more famous, because she studies the effects and the relationship between energy intake and weight regulation. And so the influence of external features like exercise, nutrition, and also timing. So the timing of food. So I'm delighted to share my thumbnail with the two of you.
Very good. Thank you, and welcome to the panelists. I'll read the questions. The first question is from a Brainstorms regular, Joe Virgil, who asked the same question I was thinking is, what about shift work? What about people who have to work at night or who do shift work and every 2 weeks switch from day shift to night shift? How does this affect them?
Right, and so let me give a basic sort of, spell out the basic problem, and then I can invite Molly and Laura to describe the kinds of physiological and metabolic effects. So theoretically, if you were a permanent night worker, it would presumably be okay as long as you stayed a night worker over the weekends. So, if there were no shifts and you just worked nights or just worked days and abided by that schedule, went home, wearing sunglasses, avoiding the light when you shouldn't be seeing it in this, because you're really behaving like a hamster, you should be okay. The problem is generally people like to spend time with their families during the weekends. Now, the question of, what about a true shift worker, where either you're rotating every 2 weeks or other kinds of schedules, whether you're advancing or delaying or how you're doing it, the basic problem is that the circadian system, as you know, with jet lag, has some inertia, and we can't flip it. It can't be flipped. And you see in that diagram I gave of the hierarchy of the system, there are all sorts of time lags that even if the SCN or part of the SCN flipped right away, it may take more time for those organs. And so, Laura and Molly, what does that mean to people sort of living on these schedules? I'll ask Laura first.
Sure. So shift work generally shift workers are actually a population that kind of serve as the canaries in the coal mine for looking at negative effects of circadian disruption. So as Bill talked about in his presentation, of course, we all likely experience some circadian disruption when we do things like social jet lag, getting up later on the weekends versus the week. But shift workers experience this to a much more chronic level. And we see that shift workers are at increased risk for a lot of negative health conditions, in particular, things like metabolic dysfunction, increased risk of obesity, even increased risk of certain cancers. And this has all been tied back to the disruption of their circadian clock. And I think Molly has done a lot of interesting work exploring that metabolic circadian connection. So maybe she can comment on it a little further.
Well, Laura's work with the dim light at night is really relevant to the shift work setting. But as Laura said, shift workers are at risk for all kinds of metabolic diseases. Some of that is driven by the fact that eating behavior is very out of sync with light exposures. So Bill explained beautifully how light hits the retina and sets the central clock, but all the clocks in your peripheral tissues are set in large part by neurohumoral factors that are released upon eating. So when eating behavior is out of sync with light-dark cycles, that can feed on metabolic disruption as well.
So, do you think in the future, you guys, like any sort of quantitative trait, if we could, do you think it might be that some people would be shiftable and others not, that there would be either a magic pill, which many people have been searching for, like gold, the cities of Cibola, or the Northwest Passage. So something, some way, or some approach where you could take that entire hierarchy and move it en bloc. Do you think that's possible? Or is that a pipe dream?
I think being aware of your circadian system can be helpful. So there's work showing that part of the association between shift work and metabolic dysfunction comes down to even just food choices when you're tired being worse. So being aware of that connection and knowing like, oh, maybe I shouldn't go for that bag of potato chips late at night can be helpful for some people. But I don't think there's an immediate cure or pill we can take, but kind of knowing and living a healthy lifestyle, trying to eat at the right time of day, exercise at the best time of day to optimize performance, all of those things, being aware of our circadian system can help.
Yeah, and I would totally agree. That was a good answer, Laura. And I would just add, we're doing some actually pretty cool work in our lab. I don't think I've even told you about it, Bill, where one of the entrainers of peripheral clocks is also catecholamines that are molecules that get released when you exercise. So in mice, at least, if even in a mice that's in conditions of rotating shift work where the light dark cycles are changing all the time, if a 24-hour bout of exercise once every 24 hours seems to be able to maintain muscle rhythms. And we are hoping that that in the long run will maintain insulin sensitivity, since muscles drive glucose tolerance in a big way. So I don't know if it's a magic bullet bill, but it's pretty interesting research.
Okay, great. So next question, Dikshita asks, how about the circadian rhythm effects for people who live in Alaska or Norway or near the Arctic Circle, where winter is dark and summer is never dark?
So, you know, the natural experiment has sort of been ruined by artificial light to a greater or lesser extent. And, you know, it turns out that, you know, humans are sensitive to, in terms of the entraining potential of light, to, you know, room light like we've got on our thumbnails here. You don't need excessively bright light. On the other hand, animals, or various kinds of animals, live north of the Arctic Circle, reindeer, for example, certain kinds of birds. And those have been studied, and it's interesting because it turns out that it's species specific what happens, but some, like some reindeer, lose their overt rhythmicity, so they become arrhythmic, almost like they have a destruction of their suprachiasmatic nucleus. What's not entirely clear is whether that's due to the fact that the clock has actually stopped, or whether the outputs of the clock have just been disarticulated. So it might be you have an old type of analog clock and you just remove the hands, so it no longer runs rhythmically, but the clock is still running. So these are interesting sort of experiments of nature that people are sort of working out. There is, in people, sort of an increased incidence of, as you might imagine, winter depression, winter insomnia. So even with artificial light, there are effects at the poles.
Okay, so Jolynn asks about aging. How does aging affect the circadian rhythms?
Do you guys want to have a go at that to start?
Sure, I'll jump in on that one. So some of my lab's research is on aging and associations between the circadian system and aging. And generally, as people age, you see more of a breakdown in some of their, or dampening of some of their circadian rhythms. So you don't see as robust rhythms in things like activity, or even in the release of certain hormones in our bodies as people age. We're also interested in how this relates to immune function as we age. So you also see changes in how our immune cells, how rhythmic they are, and how that becomes depressed with age. And it can affect things very broadly, from how someone might respond to surgery or even a vaccine.
Okay.
I can add sort of also about, you know, certainly, and maybe Laura was mentioning this. There's been a big recent interest now in disrupted sleep-wake cycles and neurodegeneration, which is a topic in itself. So this, you know, this weakening of the circadian system, or the misalignment of its components, has now generated a lot of interest that these may not only be the markers of disease, but actually might be contributing to disease.
I think one condition in particular is something with neurodegeneration is something called sundowning syndrome, where people in later phases of Alzheimer's disease, for example, can show more agitation or disrupted behavior right around sunset. So there's been a lot of research trying to understand why this occurs and how it relates to the clock.
You're muted, Mike. You're muted, Mike.
Sorry, my space bar stopped working. Nancy has a very practical question. What's the best time to take melatonin to counteract jet lag?
So I can start with this. Maybe, Nancy, I might give a broader sort of approach to jet lag. I would say the number one sort of approach to jet lag would be to shift yourself before you fly. My wife and I did that once years ago before we took a trip to Switzerland and just advanced ourselves by 20 minutes every day for a couple of weeks. And we were advanced by 3 hours, not quite the 6 hours, but when we arrived, we were in pretty good shape. It was like we had flown across the country instead of the ocean. And doing it together psychologically, it didn't seem off. Certainly the most powerful sort of resynchronizer is light. And so it's important when you arrive. So for example, in the usual, when the transatlantic flights begin again, or they have, and we arrive sort of in the morning, is to stay out and get light during when you would like your day to be. Even if you're falling asleep, if you're outside at a cafe, that's fine. Close your eyes with your cappuccino. You still get the outside light, as opposed to being in the museum during the day. Others use melatonin, and it relates to something called the phase response curve for melatonin to know when you want to be taking it. But it's geared toward your anticipated sleep onset. But the timing is sort of related to when the clock is most sensitive to the melatonin. On the other hand, if you do a complete inversion, like flying to Japan, good luck. That's difficult.
I would only add that on transatlantic flights, how they're plying you with food and liquor kind of constantly. If you can forego some of that and be hungry, along with when you arrive in the morning in Europe, that's going to help set both central and peripheral clocks. So if you can do without, I recommend it.
Very good. So Ryan asked the question, I've never heard of this. So what do you believe that the everyman sleep cycle is effective?
So the everyman, I think, is he defined it for us, didn't he? I think I saw.
He
Right.
wrote in it 4 hours.
4
sleep
hour
interval.
cycles with about a 20-minute nap every 4 hours.
Yeah. Do you guys have any experience with the everyman cycle?
And, intuitively, it doesn't sound very like it would be very aligned with biology.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have for the usual consolidated sleep cycle, we have pretty complex physiological mechanisms, what's called a homeostatic mechanism, a circadian mechanism, and of course, presumably, when our ancestors in the wild, there was a fitness advantage to have a consolidated sleep cycle, either when it was dangerous to be out foraging, when there was a thermal challenge, And so presumably that evolved, under those circumstances. And you could argue, as you do, that now perhaps that doesn't really weigh anymore, and perhaps we'd be like Leonardo da Vinci or others who just take multiple naps. And so that would be sort of an argument for it. I guess I'd have to say I'm not up on the data on the advantage of it. It's certainly, from a societal point of view, unless you're in a certain kind of work, it might be difficult to integrate that into society unless we change society.
Yeah, the data on sleep time are that over the last, 20 years at least, if not longer, sleep time in the US at least is getting shorter and shorter. And it's coincident with all kinds of metabolic diseases. It doesn't mean it's causal, but shorter and shorter sleep time is coincident with all metabolic diseases.
I think something else interesting to mention that people often ask about is what about short sleepers? And data on short sleepers suggests that there are very few true short sleepers. So Bill might know better. I think it's like 1% to 2% of the population are actually short sleepers, like only need 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. But many more people think they're short sleepers. And by limiting their sleep, they're actually doing a lot of damage, like Molly's mentioning, disrupting metabolic function and other things.
A kind of interesting, Molly had mentioned, we're talking about short sleep. One interesting study, which I found really neat, coming out of the University of Colorado, studying sort of in the laboratory, sort of acutely shortening sleep. And they showed the kinds of metabolic problems that Molly had described, including, weight gain. And when they looked at what the subjects were doing when they were not sleeping, like after dinner, they were eating, and eating at, as Molly has told us, the wrong time of day, when the liver, et cetera, are not expecting the pizza to be coming down the hatch. And so, part of, at least part of this problem with the detrimental effects of short sleep may be a circadian problem of what people are doing when they're not sleeping, at least partly. And food is the freshman 15, as we would say.
So here's a fascinating question. So you've talked about the circadian clock, but is there another master regulator clock on a slower cycle that's controlling aging?
I don't know the answer to that. These guys might. I will say that people have asked a different question, and that is whether aging, and the aging clock, if you will, is related to circadian timekeeping. And so, with mutants that have slower clocks or faster clocks, people have looked, for example, in fruit flies and others, and there isn't strong data that that's directly shortening or lengthening lifespan. I don't know about the aging, the telomere clock.
Yeah. So telomeres shorten as you age, but it's not really well known how that's regulated or why telomeres shorten faster, or telomeres are the ends of your chromosomes. And it's not really known why some shorten faster. I mean, it's known if like pollutants and carcinogens can influence that process, but the general, why does Bill live longer than me? Still a question we need to figure out. And of course, that's the golden question, right? How do you help people live longer and more healthy lives?
So there's a question here about pointing out that, so clock genes or abnormalities in clock genes are associated with mood disorders, but does entrainment to unnatural patterns of light, can that cause mood disorders?
I think that's one for Laura.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we know that there are definitely associations between the circadian system and mood, even at the level of, if you look at Twitter posts, there's actually a rhythm in people posting more negative affect words later in the day versus more positive ones in the morning. When people experience things like circadian disruption, shift work, having lights or computers on at night, there are some associations between circadian disruption and an increase in the risk for mood disorders. And we were talking about shift workers kind of being a population where these questions can be explored more broadly. And shift workers are at an increased risk for mood disorders as well. And that's some of the questions that we've tried to address in my lab, is looking at in mice, even if you leave lights on late at night. So basically we give them lighting equivalent to having a TV screen on at night, and we look at how that regulates their mood-related behaviors. And we see this negative association where if they have lights on at unnatural times, have electric lights on, they tend to have perform poor or have impairments in mood in behavioral assays.
What about the inverse? What about using light therapy to help treat mood disorders?
Yeah, that was first that was first tested with people experiencing seasonal affective disorder. This idea that it relates to the changing external light cycle. So when you get into winter months, you see in some people who experience seasonal affective disorder, that they'll have seasonal depression. And originally people thought that this association might just be the holiday blues, but it was really shown that it relates to changing seasonal lighting and doing things like bright light morning therapy. Having really bright light exposure in the morning can help some patients that experience seasonal affective disorder. And now they've gone on more broadly to look at this, even in people who don't experience seasonal affective disorder. And some of the effects of the bright light treatment may have to do with the fact that in our modern environment, we really don't get that bright light exposure that we used to. So we talk about having electrical lights on at night disrupting our circadian system, but we also experience much dimmer levels of light during the day. So most of us are in these dim offices. Office lighting is many-fold lower than bright sunlight that we would experience if we were outside.
Yeah, I grew up in Minnesota, and winter was always depressing, and I assumed because it was the weather's bad. And then I moved to the south and discovered it snows because the days are short. So there's a question that's about genetic defects. So are there genetic mutations that affect the circadian cycle, especially those related to genetic-based disorders?
Yes, and the answer is yes. So, you know, the cracking of the molecular basis of the clock really began in the 70s with two labs. One was a Drosophila lab, as you might imagine. The other was a lab working on Neurospora, which is a fungus. And the Drosophila studies in the 70s revealed this mutation, which was mapped to a single locus, which was named period or per. And the amazing sort of story about this is that, you know, a gene which was found in fruit flies turns out to have a homologue in people. And already now, for example, differences in phase of entrainment, like early birds and late and night owls, people are uncovering polymorphisms in so-called clock genes. So for example, in the delayed sleep phase syndrome that I showed you a couple of years ago, a mutation of cryptochrome, one of those clock genes, was found in a family. So it really is true, even in one person's lifetime, that they've gone from fruit fly experiments to understanding previously unrecognized sleep disorders in humans. It's really spectacular, actually, and more are being found. I'll bet that some of these cited people with non-24-hour sleep-wake syndrome have genetic problems with the melanopsin system, one way or the other. And you can imagine then that a melanopsin defect might render you circadianly blind, but not blind for form vision. And how would that be picked up? Well, by no one. I mean, it would end up going to the psychiatrist, not the ophthalmologist. So the understanding of clocks, the genetic basis of clocks, it's just been spectacular. It's really spectacular. And this has all occurred really, the great push, although it's been known for almost 300 years, more or less. It was debated for a while, but certainly longer, that there's an internal clock. In the last 50 or so, the kind of stuff that I showed you, all of that has been uncovered in that period of time. And so people now realize that the problem with shift work, or the problem with short days, all of those is not our passive response to this. It's really the impact on the function and adaptation of an internal physiological system. So the answer is yes, and there'll be more to come.
Yeah, almost all the mutations that have been directly examined in animals have been, some version of them has been shown to be the case in humans as well. Advanced sleep phase syndrome that Bill mentioned earlier is a combination of genetic defects in period and in the clock gene. So yeah, a few years ago, the person who's probably the world expert in advanced sleep phase syndrome, Louis Tasek, came to Austin, and he was telling us about looking for families that have this trait. And I was like, oh, I think my family has this trait, because my mom and my brother both wake up really early, and I never thought of it as being familial, but he's like, pay attention to what your family members are doing and behaviorally in terms of the clock, and it could be a genetic alteration.
And it's worth saying, with the UT connection, of course, these guys know what I'm going to say, that Michael Young, who was an undergrad and graduate student here in the 70s, then at Caltech and then at Rockefeller, was one of three. The other two were from Brandeis, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for actually elucidating that basic little cartoon of this transcription translation feedback loop, and for identifying some of these critical genes. So there's just like the spike protein, there's a COVID connection with circadian. There's a UT connection with circadian clocks.
So here's a question that wonders about the effects on the circadian cycle for someone who tends to wake up at the same time every morning, but where there's some variability, plus or minus a couple of hours, at what time they go to bed at night.
So I would love to see your actogram. And you know, so it starts getting difficult, because we didn't talk about sort of the other regulator of sleep. So there are two regulators of sleep. One is the circadian one, which we've talked about, which it sort of is responsible for its duration and timing. The other is related to how long you've been awake. So the longer you're awake, the sleepier you'll be. And so the waveform that you're describing, the waveform of the consolidated sleep, is sort of made up of an integrated synthesis of these two physiological regulators. And you can imagine then changing one or not the other, or the strength of one and not the other could change sleep onset but not offset, the placement of sleep, the intensity of sleep, how deeply you sleep, which is an important issue that's not routinely measured because it's a little bit more difficult. And so, graphing these sleep outs in actogram format can give a lot of information. What's interesting is, and related to your question, people are interested in their sleep. There are trackers, as you know, Fitbits, trackers, all sorts. They may give more or less of a verifiable signal, but the main point is that we're sort of putting circadian clocks out in the field. So, how the clocks behave and how they adapt in the real world is a critical question that we know much less about in animals and people. It's really human ecology. And now with trackers and people tracking these things, we're going to learn much more about how the system behaves in the wild. To give you just an idea, sloths, and their name for this, in zoos, sloths that come from Panama, certain species, sleep in the zoo 15 hours a day. They're very slothful. But of course, that's normal for a sloth in the zoo. But if you're trying to understand sleep and trying to understand mechanisms, perhaps it's only a certain environmental condition. And so now a number of researchers have been looking at frigate birds, sloths, others in the wild. And so sloths have been wearing all sorts of gear in Panama, trackers, and this sloth sleeps 7 hours a day. So 15 hours is not abnormal in the zoo, but it's not telling us everything we need to know about the regulation of clocks and rhythms. So I think the future of ecological, taking clocks in the wild is really going to be fascinating.
So there's a question about people who experience kind of a shifting sleep cycle where there are phases when they're tired very early and then phases where they stay up late.
Well, again, this sort of irregular patterns, I'm going to bet some of them are free running. I think there are more of these people than we know. And, they start as irregular, which is exactly the complaint of Mr. AP. It was irregular, it made no sense. I took that first sheet of paper, it didn't look like anything. I couldn't tell what was going on. But then when you look at it from 35,000 feet, sometimes you see these patterns. I was actually, a short story, I was called by one of the other Nobel Prize winners. Would I talk to somebody who had called him from Tucson because she said she thought her daughter had 24-hour sleep-wake syndrome. And so I talked to her, the daughter, and she was an artist. And she said, right. She had followed it along. She was sure she had it, and she loved it. And when she was forced to go on a rigid schedule, her artistic ability was somehow muted or lost. And so this issue that I saw in the chat that The melanopsin sort of system in cells is also projecting beyond the SCN to a number of areas which we associate with mood and motion and so forth. We start to see, the non-photic effects of light and the timing of light. Wow, what will we learn 50 years from now?
I think something to add to what Bill was saying there about non-24-hour sleep-wake disorders is that some people may develop schedules that are very off because of things like changes in environmental lighting. So in a certain percentage of the population, especially if you see these behaviors emerge and then remit, it might have to do with things like social cues or the loss of social cues if you lived with a roommate and then you don't have a roommate, or if you're indoors a lot for a long period of time or watching a lot of TV late at night, or changing factors that could affect your circadian system. So kind of being aware of those things may be helpful as well.
Mm-hmm. And your kids too, keeping an eye on late night video gaming and YouTube. Good idea.
So Laura, given the importance of light, the intensity of light, wavelength, other sort of features of light, an area that I don't think has been raised by the circadian community are social disparities in the ability to access light of the proper type. Do you have any?
That's a really interesting point. I haven't looked into that much, but I think that's a really important point. Especially light isn't just something in your home, but it's also something that surrounds your home. So for example, having lights on in the community, or I used to live by the UT intramural fields, for example, and it's broad daylight even at 11 p.m. because they leave those lights on all the time. And certain communities, of course, are going to have more exposure to environmental light pollution. So that's something important to think about.
So here's a question. I'm pretty sure my wife is asking this question. She's going to tell me the answer later, but do you have any tips for becoming a morning person? This person's been a night owl and it's hard to wake up and they would like to be more of a morning person.
Well, I can, since it's a family member of yours, I can describe a family member of mine who was a severe night owl. Was very creative at night, but had to be dragged out to school in the morning. And, circadian guy like I am, I gave a circadian prescription, which is based on when to stimulate the SCN, presumably, what time to be stimulating it with light. And so bright morning light tends to advance the clock, move it forward. Evening light tends to delay it. So, for example, working on the computer, bright light at night will tend to push your clock later, all things considered, whereas bright light in the morning will tend to wake it up earlier, move it earlier. And of course, you have to use both. Otherwise, if you have light in the morning and light at night, it just sort of jiggles, presumably. And so I gave the proper circadian prescription of bright light in the morning and dim in the evening, and it worked. However, this person was very unhappy and said that they weren't thinking right. And apparently a number, I don't have, I've heard about this and I don't know the literature on it, but apparently there are delayed sleep phase people who, when treated this way, so that they're like all of us in society, they don't like it. They don't actually feel well. So And so there's something going on about the constitution there, more than just sort of moving the lights. So I can't really help your wife, and I don't want to disrupt the marital status.
So the irony here is that it's about time to wrap up. And
oh, your space bar, Mike, it went off.
sorry, the irony here is that it's about time to wrap up, and my computer monitor is slowly turning down the blue light. So and so that's our cue. How about if each of our panelists just gives us one quick tidbit of something that we should know about circadian rhythms that hasn't been discussed so far? Real quick, maybe 30 seconds each.
I would say my tip is, if you haven't gotten your COVID vaccine yet, circadian studies have shown that vaccines are most effective when they're given in the early morning compared to later in the day. And that's not specific to the COVID vaccine, but just vaccines in general. So that's my take-home tip today.
I want to make sure and mention that because Bill Schwartz is a very humble person. He was actually one of the very first people to identify the SCN in the brain and showed the link between circadian clocks and metabolism by looking at rhythmicity of glucose metabolism in the brain. So he's another really amazing link between really cutting edge original circadian research and UT.
Oh, thank you, Molly. That's very kind. I think my tip would be, just as you know your phenotype, blue eyes, dark hair, you have hypertension or whatever, just like you know your phenotype, the same as your chronotype, that is whether you're early or late, or what time is the best time for you to be doing things. Maybe the evening is good for copy editing and the morning is good for something else. And those are really your makeup. Those are part of your genetic makeup, as well as the lighting, so forth. So the time of day, the right time of day, right timing is important.
Okay, well, again, unsatisfying, but we'll have to all send Dr. Bill Schwartz, Dr. Laura Funkin, and Dr. Molly Bray a virtual applause. This is really fun. Thank you so much for doing it. It was brilliant. I'm going to close by just, and so thank you all very much. Fantastic. I'm going to close with this flyer for next week or next month. Our speaker is Dr. Emily, who we just hired away from another university, and she's going to be talking about hearing loss and strategies for hearing restoration, which is something that her own work has an important implications about. So with that, Bill, Laura, Molly, thank you so much, and I hope to see everybody in a month at the next brainstorms.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you for including me.